Okay. Let me see here. All right. All right. I have to apologize. I'm going to do a mean thing. I'm sorry. I'm apologizing in advance. It was done to me, so I'm doing it to you. I was abused as a child. The trauma of slavery made, because my dad couldn't pick cotton as fast as the others in our family, they made him stay home and read at 2. He passed on this trauma, made me read at 4. Then he'd use big words and then make me look them up in the dictionary, and then use medical terms and make me look them up in the medical dictionary. Scarred me for life. All right? So, raised by a liberation theologist grandpa, this is the Bible grandma gave me, standard King James Version, right? Red letter, right? So I told you where liberation theology came from. We had to work with what we had to work with, right? So red letter Bible, so the words of Jesus are red, and so Grandpa says we follow those. He may preach from other texts, but this is what we follow. Jesus said it, we believe it. If he did it, we believe it. What did Jesus say about gays? Nothing. What did Jesus say about racism? Nothing. Okay? Keep people from stoning other people, heal the sick, feed the hungry, free people. That's what we about. Period. End of discussion. Right? So, so he said you have to find the words of Jesus in the original Aramaic, but he didn't say Aramaic. So my cousin Kenny found George Lamza. So this is, like I said the other day, the Aramaic Peshitta is in the British Museum in Cairo. So people have done translations from it, right? This one is published by HarperCollins. It's basically from, I think, the 30s or something like that. Go back to DocCam view, if you would. Crew, thanks. So George M. Lamsa's translation from the Aramaic of the Peshitta. So Old Testament and New Testament. So from the ancient Eastern text. So you can get it. It's published by HarperCollins, which is basically owned by Rupert Murdoch, so the Fox News guy. So one of the pieces that you should understand is that Lamsa was a native Aramaic, or also known as Syriac speaker, but the times that he was publishing in were conservative, and this is a conservative publisher, even though it's basically being published under one of their quote-unquote new, HarperCollins also does a lot of quote-unquote new age stuff, right? So this is kind of like what would happen at the U of O, where ethnic studies used to be under folklore. Wait, folklore? Like we making stuff up to make us feel good? It's fairy tales? No, nice try. All right, so the idea is that many people, the Peshitta basically was originally published in Syriac in 450 AD. And many, as you saw in class, many Christians can't even identify when the King James Version was created, around about the 1600s, late 1500s, by King James. And there's actually a book about that, which I also have in my library, because you want to study the narrative of where something came from. And the book is called God's Secretaries, the creation of the King James Version of the Bible. And it's kind of celebratory, but you look at the cover, and it's all white guys. Like, wait, you couldn't find any African biblical scholars in the 1600s in England? or in the world? Why you do that? So there are other people that have done some work. So as an example, this is the, you might not be able to see this, but it's the original African Heritage Study Bible. Okay? It's the King James Version, except that this is Moses. Obviously, he don't look like Charlton Heston. And not only is this a red letter Bible, but it is also, so when it's got pictures pictures of contemporary black people in biblical garb taken in the Holy Land. And it also has not just red letter, but wherever the text is shaded, the book basically says we are referring specifically to African Edenic people, as they put it. And the reason they say African Edenic is when you go to, for example, Genesis. Yes. Boundaries of the Garden of Eden, the first people, African Edenic. Now it gives the boundary, in Genesis, it gives the boundaries of the Garden of Eden. A river ran out of Eden and divided into 4 heads. Right? And it names the 4 heads, but you get the Hebrew names, not the names we know today. The names we know today, in order of mention, Blue and White Nile, Tigris and Euphrates. Look on a map, Blue and White Nile, Africa, Ethiopia and Egypt, downtown Baghdad, and all the country in between is the Garden of Eden, if you do a literal interpretation of the Bible. Who's that? So, Christianity is an African religion. It's African people that wrote the Bible and the oldest versions of it. People do not say that they are cursed by God when they're writing their own holy book. Okay? That would be a lie. Understand that. Okay? Put upon people to control them. Now, this is what I was told before this book existed. So the African Heritage Study Bible basically saying, okay, this is our stuff, right? But it's still King James Version, and they chose basically to say, okay, here's where the references are, and here are historical references. These are Afrocentric scholars as well as biblical scholars that basically, shall we say, conspired to create this particular version of it, and then populate it with pictures of black people, particularly where scriptures or historical records say that black people were there. Now, again, it's still KJV, but I showed you the Peshitta. And when I was quoting the other day from this particular one, which, we rotate that. All right, translation of the Aramaic Peshitta, parallel edition, the Gospel of Matthew. I got this from Amazon, actually. And essentially, what this parallel edition, if you open it up, what you see is the original Aramaic Peshitta text, and then translated by 5 different scholars, line by line. And it's all Matthew. And obviously they intend to do the entire New Testament. I haven't gotten that version yet. I got this like 15 years ago. Probably still in print. So the reason I'm abusing you like this is, I'm saying that liberation theology, as it started in 1830, has kind of evolved. So part of, understand that there might be an edit job being done. An edit job in the sense that you may or may not know about other things, other scriptures that are basically the same time of the Bible that were edited out. You can also find other writings by Lamsa and others where he basically does a line-by-line translation of different scriptures from the original Peshitta into English. Again, this is all available on Amazon, which is why I'm showing it to you. If you want to do your own work, if you want to focus on that particular thing. One of my favorites, Prayers of the Cosmos, because I know the author personally. This particular book is a line-by-line translation of the Lord's Prayer from Aramaic into English with all the alternate translations that are inherent within that particular language. And further study the hidden gospel. Which also gives you another context in terms of looking at the religion as well. Decoding the spiritual message of the Aramaic Jesus. So, and there are other folks. Aramaic. Also on Amazon. All right. Reason I point that out is when we look at systems of discrimination and we study the literature that black scientists have done, black scientists as well as others have written, usually it requires that you read a lot of books. I'm sorry. That's the way it is. All right. So, to instill conscientiousism is a Brazilian word because we don't really have an equivalent of it in English, though they try. Conscientiousism is both a noun, a verb, and a state of being. So a lot of times it's a noun, a verb, because it's active. It's a noun because it's also a state of being, like being cold or chill or deep, in all the ways that we use those words. Be chill, be cold. That's deep. So, literally means learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take actions against the oppressive elements of reality. All right? So there is no word in English that actually says all that in one word. Conscientious, doesn't really come close. And that's a lot of what you find. So, for example, some of the questions that I got, especially that I asked about, well, what do I do with my King James Version of the Bible? Should I just throw it out? Well, no, you can't. You can't. That's what you're familiar with. You can't throw out your roots. You have to understand where the story came from, but you have to understand this ain't the whole story. Stuff got left out. In a good way and in a bad way. You got to take it all. Look, the Ku Klux Klan and Martin Luther King both use the King James Version of the Bible as the reason for what they do. That's a contradiction. You got to resolve that. Everything that Yeshua did was coming out of Judaic culture. Everything. Yet, how do you get anti-Semitism as part of Catholicism and mainstream Christianity? That's a contradiction. There's a history behind that. How do you get a book that's written by Africans that basically justifies racism, even when Africans take it on and use it against themselves? I mean, that's not the only book where that happens. How do Muslims justify enslaving black Africans and sending them to America? Because they did that. Jews too. Nobody's blameless here. Right? There's those contradictions. Life is complicated. Sorry. It is. Part of being adult is we realize the fairy tales of our childhood, we got to grow out of them. Though we may maintain those fairy tales for a little time. You know, part of your growing up is you learn that there wasn't no tooth fairy, no Santa Claus, and no Easter bunny. I'm sorry if you hadn't heard that before now. My bad. All right, so conscientious is sound. So it requires that you know what a healthy functioning condition is, either by practicing it yourself or seeing enough of the condition to want to emulate it. So let's say conscientious sound is about, okay, in order to be free, I got to reconcile these contradictions. What they raised me with and what I had to come to believe by not believing the fairy tales or seeing behind the fairy tales. And sometimes people I trust tell me fairy tales. They believe it. That doesn't mean I have to. So conscientious is out. So so you got to understand what a healthy, free condition is and want to emulate it. And the practice of that freedom comes from taking action against oppressive elements of reality. What some addiction treatment texts, so for example, call problems related to the social environment, could either mean one's social group or one's relationship to the society. Now, the reason why I bring in addiction is because many of us think, this is an extension of liberation theology, we see racism as a co-occurring disorder. Now, what that means is you have a mental illness and an addiction. Racists are like crackheads. Okay? Do you trust what a crackhead says when they're on crack? No. Do you trust if somebody has a fever, they have a really bad flu, and they just babbling, or if you've had a really bad flu and you just have these dreams, we call them fever dreams, do you take those as reality? No. Okay? So people are under the influence of a virus or drug, they're definitely off. But sometimes the virus that they're working off of is what we call a meme. They believe something that ain't true, but it has driven them to this extreme. I don't know if I want to get into, well, why not? I'm working off the theory, especially after something I read in the paper today. This kid, I think it's a white kid, I haven't Googled his picture, but this kid in New Mexico that just killed his parents and his siblings. Teenager, killed his parents and his siblings in New Mexico. Somehow, it's a little thing in the paper, but basically they're saying, oh, well, he's not mentally ill. Everybody's saying, oh, he's a normal teenager. Really? Normal teenagers kill their parents who are deep in the church and all that kind of stuff? Like a mass murder? Shooting? Wow. That's normal? Okay, so here's where the dangerous part is. My personal theory, these school shooters are normal. We are trying to explain, they're mentally ill. They went off. They snapped. No. What if, 50 years ago when the Klan was bombing churches and people were killing civil rights leaders and the law enforcement people knew who it was and didn't arrest them, those people that did that were considered normal. Nothing was done. Nothing. So you accepted that. Our society accepted racism as normal. Bombing a church on Sunday morning and killing 4 little girls of Spike Lee movie, that was normal. Nothing was done even though they knew who the perpetrators were. Not only the local cops, but the FBI knew who it was and did nothing. Therefore, it's normal. So I'm just saying what goes around comes around. And now you have a normal, not mentally ill kid who shoots up a school full of kids. So the problem is that they're not abnormal. The problem is, maybe the problem is normal. What you're defining is normal. That you make deadly force more accessible than healing. You've made that normal. You've made self-development not normal. Maybe you need to redefine what normal is. Because what you've done is create a normal society where violence is prevalent instead of healing is prevalent. So that's what I'm saying. The problem is normal. So this is coming out of conscientious exam. Wait, this is a contradiction. How come there's violent video games instead of video games that teach you about how to find your culture? How to find healing? How come you don't have video games based on that? Yeah, paradox, it is. Right. So, addiction, co-occurring disorder. Racism is both a mental illness and an addiction. They're strung out on believing something that isn't real. I barely believe in human supremacy. I think we should give the planet back to the cockroaches because we're like messing it up. So I don't believe in white supremacy, definitely, but I don't believe in human supremacy either. I'm not saying you replace white supremacy with supremacy of people of color. I ain't saying that. I'm saying, look, these are all your relatives. Act like it. That should be normal, but it ain't. Isn't. I should speak like a college professor, right? All right. In the face of social inequities, the counseling relationship should address these issues in the client and with the practitioner. So the reason I'm oriented towards this, I'm both an ethnic studies teacher and an addictions person, and Black addiction science says we can't just look at your relationship with this substance. We also have to make you understand that you are part of an economic and cultural relationship, and it is that relationship that has created you, the addict. So you have to understand, oh, why is there crack in my neighborhood when we don't speak Spanish? Oh, well, it was brought here. Well, why is it brought here? Because an addicted population is a controlled population. As long as you're strung out, you don't become politically active.
So people say the CIA invented crack.
I don't know if the CIA invented crack. We haven't gotten to that time period yet. But they definitely did facilitate part of its spread in Los Angeles. So, social inequities exist. So, a liberative discourse between the client and practitioner and among our community. So, learning to perceive those contradictions and the history. So, it is most likely the first ism was sexism, or discrimination against women. About the time of Abraham, with the erasure of the 99 names of the goddess being turned into the 99 beautiful names of Allah, the suppression of the moon goddess Alat, whose symbols were crescent moon and the star, in favor of Allah, and made male-dominant Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. This is all happening at more or less the same time, because all three of the Abrahamic religions revere the patriarch Abraham, who basically did that action, that editing action at the Kaaba. So this all, okay, there's the contradiction there, right? Because most African religions also have a sacred feminine. Look for it. assume that it's there. You can't have civilization without women. And women often act as a civilizing aspect to humanity for very practical reasons, right? So if it's missing, somebody erased it. So, isms themselves. I made this acronym because I do a lot of my thinking on the freeway. And I thought an ism, this is like a suffix added to a noun. So race becomes racism, sex becomes sexism, class becomes classism, age becomes ageism, etc., etc., etc. So ISM, individual, structural, social mentality. So coming out of the literature that studies this, which is basically black psychiatrists, studying racism, which is where most of the literature comes from on this particular deal, what I did was compress them into 6 different kinds, because if you make a big model, people don't get it. But if you can fit it into 10 fingers, they can get it, right? So let's say that there are 6 types of isms. So the first one is type 1, verbal and physical assault. So let's say it's racism. They call you nigger. And you may do the trick of, you're mispronouncing it. The correct pronunciation is Niger or nega. Well, that could get you shot with the wrong person, but right, you do that at least in your mind, right? Verbal and physical assault, type 1. This is the one that the law usually passes laws against. They call you a name. Supreme Court says use of nigger in the workplace is fighting words. You know, if you call me a nigger, I can assume that because of the history of the word. So if you remember the image, the pickaninny image, which if you don't write a social context, I'm assuming you're doing this as an ethnic slur. Right? Because of the history. Supreme Court ruling, right? So it's legal, right? You say nigger, the history of that word means I'm assuming violence is about to ensue and I can preemptively kick your ass. Now, I may get arrested for it. And actually, old school, we were told, okay, if you get called nigger at school by a white kid, tell the teacher first, but if the teacher don't do nothing, kick their ass. They won't call you nigger no more. Of course, then they'll use it to get you in trouble, right? So you got to deal with those consequences as well. Right? That was old school. Many of us were raised like that. So type 2, nonverbal microaggressions. Where this came from is a black psychiatrist, Chester Pierce, still alive, Chet's still alive, did some of the original work. Some of his earlier references are published around 78, and basically it goes like this. Chet was a Navy Commodore, and he Harvard-trained psychiatrist, and he's studying extreme environments, like what happens to you in Antarctica, right? Because the Navy wants to know what happens to you in Antarctica, right? It's cold. It's 100 degrees below zero. You go outside to pee, your pee freezes. Your breath freezes in front of your face. It's dark. What drives you crazy? They want to know, right? So Chet figured out it's not the environment that makes you go crazy. It's the interactions between people. You know how boys do when we get, we put each other down and, insult each other and it's to talk about, play the dozens, talk about your mama or whatever, right? It's those kind of things. And Chet called those microaggressions. Doesn't come to blows. They're just using everyday phrases to get under your skin, but pretending that they're not. I didn't mean anything by it. Chet, being black, takes that scientific finding and says being black in America is like living in Antarctica. You feel the chill constantly. And they're not calling you nigger all the time. What they're doing is these little microaggressions that kind of get under your skin, but they're like so everyday you can't point to something unless you talk with somebody else that's experienced it and they go, yeah, they do that. Right? Microaggressions. So somebody from the U of O, Daryl Wing Su, Chinese psychologist, and some others, expanded on Chet's work and basically said there are 9 species of microaggressions. 9 different ones. And here's how we work this out in therapy. And they wrote a paper which said, okay, let's say that there's a black client and a white therapist. Here is how microaggressions are going to play out in that therapeutic relationship. 9 different ways, right? So I'm just giving you the overview here. Type 3. So the first 2 are done by individuals, against individuals. Type 3 is where it happens in an institutional setting, and the reason that is type 3 is unconscious. The institution is unaware or makes no policy that people within it are doing type 1 and type 2. And they just let it happen. Right? So it's a stage of evolution. Right? That we find ourselves within the 20th century. Right? So some of those examples could be like, so I'll use a local example. So I'm faculty, and now I'm the second longest surviving black faculty at Lane Community College in its history. So people don't necessarily say anything to me, to my face, but they'll say things to other people, knowing either that it'll get back to me or not caring. So there was a hiring in a particular department in which they had screened out all the minority candidates. And with the white candidates, they would say stuff like, oh, students couldn't understand this person's accent. Now, the accent that we're talking about is a very light Yugoslavic accent. Lighter than, say, from Brooklyn or Georgia. So wait, American accents are okay, but Yugoslavic, English accent's okay? A French accent's okay, but a Yugoslavic accent? By the way, that's illegal. It's illegal for you to even say that. So I raised a complaint when they hired a couple of people where we're going, no, there was irregularities all through this process. Documented. Here it is. So the head of the committee said, Harris is hiding behind his race. I'm hiding behind my race. No, he didn't call me nigger. And I'm protesting the fact that they are discriminating against white candidates. A black man is saying, okay, there's discrimination along the whole process. You already screened out all the minorities, so there's no point in talking about that, because obviously that was part of the game. Now you're discriminating against the white candidates, and I'm basically saying this is a fairness issue, and so I'm hiding behind my race. It's a microaggression. You didn't call me nigger. I'm not exactly hiding. Right? So what's that about? So discrimination in hiring happens. Right? Unconscious institutional. We have people working as housekeepers whose Spanish is their first language, and we are a not only multiracial, multicultural, but multilingual institution. So if a Spanish speaker calls another native Spanish speaker on the radio to train the other one over the radio on how to do something, we allow that. That's okay. But if their bosses say you can't speak Spanish because the white people think you're talking about them, no. If you understand Spanish, nobody's talking about you. We ain't even thinking about you. We're trying to get our job done. You cannot bar Spanish from a multilingual organization when somebody's doing their job. Besides, nobody gonna call somebody on the radio and talk about white people over the radio. I mean, come on, are you stupid? Really? So that's unconscious institutional, right? There is no explicit policy saying that we are multiliterate, and there is no written policy saying thou shalt not speak Spanish over the radio during work hours. You can assume the ethnicity of who said that, right? Unconscious institutional. Type 4, conscious institutional, it's legal. It is legal to discriminate. In fact, the institution is following the law by discriminating. The state of Oregon, the city of Eugene, Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa, the Jim Crow South. It's about discrimination. And it's legal. So we do it. It's another stage. Assume, as part of conscientious Zaun, that if this was in the institution's history and they didn't rewrite all the way back so that we're forbidding this now and they don't explicitly state that, assume it's still in operation on some level. Type 5, conscious institutional, illegal. It's illegal to discriminate, but it still happens because it's profitable. Okay, like if I show up at a, I showed up actually, for all my interviews in this state wearing a suit and a tie and a briefcase. Even working for Whitebird, that's how I showed up. And with some institutions, you have a good resume, but you don't have the front office look. Front office look is blonde hair and blue eyes. So it doesn't matter that I sound white, quote unquote, speaking in my diction. Right? People have said that. So you may have heard the story about somebody calling me up and making an appointment with Mark Harris, and she walks in and she says, "Oh, you don't look the way you sound over the phone." Right? Caller ID is that good? Caller ID has race? No. Oh, I sound taller? No, and I asked her, and there were a couple of students, from this class, not this class, but, earlier version of ethnic studies, and so their jaws dropped, and I saw them playing with her, and I said, so how did I look? What did I look like in your mind's eye? Oh, 6'8", blonde hair, blue eyes, like, okay, you just like digging your grave deeper. Yeah, I know. I said, well, I'm paid to sound white, but my voice is black at the roots. Ha ha. She gets all blushy. Look, it's okay. You must be from Oregon. She goes, yeah, how'd you know? Well, I'm from LA. Black professionals sound like this. I call it California newscaster English. No accent. Precise diction. I mean, I could, yo, what's up? I can do that. I can use an Ebonic accent, but only between black people when we're talking about things that we don't want other people to know about. That's part of the black code, right? You feel me? Okay. All right. Type 6. Sociostructural violence. Now, type 5, in order to detect it, you need precise rules of evidence. You can walk in, turn in your resume, and they will throw it away after you leave. You can call up for an apartment, have California newscaster English show up at the apartment, and they just said it's rented. Okay? That's illegal. You have been a victim of type 5 plus type 2 because it's individual. It's a microaggression. They didn't call you nigger. But if you speak well, or you speak with an accent that they like, they won't discriminate with you until they see you and, oh, no, it's rented. Now, that's illegal. But you actually have to catch them with precise rules of evidence to bust them on it. Right? It's not just your feeling. And type 6, SocioStructural violence. So the reason that SocioStructural is in the isms definition is because of Frantz Fanon, who coined this term SocioStructural violence. And what SocioStructural violence, this is where the body count is. Because it's normal practices, that word again, normal practices of society that cause excess disease and deaths. And it's built right into society, so you ain't necessarily looking for it, though you can train yourself through conscientious exam to find it. And this means that you have to do the numbers. So usually there's this term that goes along with sociostructural violence called disproportionality. How do you know if type 6 is happening? Disproportionality is one of the prime indicators. So let's see. Disproportionality is a function of statistics. All right? I flip a coin.
Tails.
Right. Heads. Okay? Statistically, 50-50, right? Two sides of the coin. Whether I do it twice, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. 50-50, right? That's a proportion. Now, if it keeps coming up heads 900 times out of 1,000, then something is producing that effect. The coin is weighted. Right? See how that works? So, disproportionality, you want to look at something happening at least twice as much as you'd expect. Okay, so as an example, we don't come to this, but since I've used Lane Community College as an example and I'm on a roll, I'll just keep on with the roll. Right? Disproportionality. So, for example, historically what we've looked at with sociostructural violence is when it was legal or when they ignored violence against black people, when that was normal. Let's say the Ku Klux Klan, to name a primary actor, killed 10 to 15,000 black people between the period of 1880 to 1910. Let's say 10,000. All right? How many of you worship the tobacco god? Yeah. It's okay. So let's say that's 10,000 people, 10 to 15,000 people historically, right? Is that an acceptable number? Can you believe that? Okay. Every year, more black people died from alcohol and tobacco than the Klan killed in its entire history. Figure is about 75,000. Let's say that in terms of, and I'm just saying, that came from John Jacobs, who was head of the Urban League at the time when he said that. More black people die every year as a result of alcohol. The actual quote is alcohol and drugs, but let's just say alcohol and tobacco every year than the Klan killed in its entire history. It's not racism, it's just business. They're just smoking the most addictive and most carcinogenic cigarettes. They just happen to have more liquor stores. That's not racism, that's just the cost of doing business. That's just business. That's normal. Fanon would say, no, that is deliberate. That's not an accident. Black people are what percentage of the American population? 11? We smoke 35% of the cigarettes. And the cigarettes that are targeted to us are menthol. Menthol suppresses the cough reflex. And these are all more carcinogenic and more addictive. Wait, 11? You would expect if it's proportional, we're only smoking 11% of cigarettes. No, we smoke 35%. If you do the math, that's 3 times. There's disproportionality. There's something creating that effect. Cigarettes good for you? No. When do we get treated for cancer? If at all? At a later stage when it's impossible to deal with? Is that an accident? Not according to SocioStructural violence. Is that too heavy for you? Here, let me go lighter. Black Americans, 11% of the U.S. population, at least 10% of the professorate. That is college professors. Actually, the A might not be in there. I'll have to check
3%
that.
doctors.
Huh?
3%.
3% doctors. But okay, so we're represented in high, basically you want to look for 1 or 2 points above that. It has to be beyond 3 points to be significant, right? So okay, we'll write in there in terms of college professors within our population, right? So if an institution is transparent, that is, if they are skilled and they apply for work, then you would expect 10% college professors at the U of O and LCC, right? Because the local hiring area is not Oregon for the purposes of affirmative action, it's national. And with the internet, it's international. Okay? With certain language groups, because 30% of all language teachers are native speakers, we're on the West Coast. It is statistically impossible to have an all-white Spanish department 10 hours away from LA on the West Coast. I'm just saying. Lane Community College, in its 40-some-odd year history, has hired 40 black people total.
Best argument for affirmative action.
Well, yeah. Okay. So let's look at hiring practices. Let's start with my hire. Okay? So I'm just showing you that what sociostructural violence is talking about is these structures are hidden within society. And they cause an effect that's measurable. And then you can get into, okay, well, how does this happen? But the fact that it is happening means, okay, so, all right, so disproportionality causes more black people to smoke more cigarettes. Disproportionality can also act to keep black people out. Not just black people. I'm just using that as an example and as an indicator. All right, so here's how, for example, and we'll talk about this when we get into affirmative action next term more, but my hire went like this. There were 44 faculty positions open from retirement. There were 1,400 people who applied for them. So 1,400 apps. Of that number, 160 were minorities. Okay, so you do the math, it's about 11%. Now, they're not all black, but they're minority. They checked the box and voluntarily identified, right? And I was one of them. Now, if this is 1992. If LCC was transparent, there were no barriers, how many minorities, if they're qualified, would you expect to be hired as part of that 44? I mean, it's straight math, right? 4% of 40, 10% of 44 is 4 people, right? Right? You'd expect 4? Reasonable? See how we got that? They hired me.
They only hired one person, which was you?
They hired one minority out of those 1,400 apps and 160 minorities. They hired me.
About 21 years ago?
Yeah. They hired me. So, the question could be raised. Am I the only minority qualified out of 160 people? I mean, I'm good, but how is that possible? So, the feds require you to do a statistical analysis. You do the analysis, those of you who are familiar with statistics. The federal standard for detecting disproportionality and discrimination is 2 standard deviations. This number is 3. Discrimination is definitely happening. It's definitely happening in hiring. Minorities are being screened out. Or definitely were in 1992. But you can also look at the demographic here as well. Right? So, sociostructural violence. Now this is like, there's nothing out there. We're a affirmative action, multiracial, diversity is a core to value institution. Right? But we're in a state that had a history. In a town that had a history, and a college that basically takes part in that history. All right, so 6 types of isms. So we'll focus